if I were to ask the average Jew, what do we celebrate on Hanukah? The two classic answers would be that, number one, we celebrate the miracle of the oil lasting 8 days. And number two, the miracle of the Maccabees, the few, conquering and defeating the many of the great Greek army. On the other hand, when we look in the Rambam, Maimonides, at the beginning of the laws of Hanukah, he tells us the story of Hanukah. Usually he doesn't tell the story of Pesach, he doesn't tell the story of Purim, but here he feels a need to tell the story of Hanukah, apparently because most people miss the boat. They don't realize why the Maccabees went to war. The Rambam does mention later the miracle of the oil lasting 8 days, but that's a secondary point. We don't establish holidays on miracles. There have been thousands of miracles over Jewish history, and we don't have thousands of holidays. The Rambam, he talks about during the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, the second temple, when the Greeks issued decrees against Israel. They didn't let us practice the Torah, they took away our money, they took away our daughters, and they oppressed us very much until Hashem, God, had mercy on us and saved us. And the Maccabees, the Kohanim from the Kohanim family, they were victorious and they saved us from the Greeks. And they set up a king from the Kohanim, from their family. V'chazra malchut liYisrael yeter al 200 shana, and sovereignty returned to Israel for more than 200 years until the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. Now, if I were to ask you, according to the Rambam, what do we celebrate on Hanukah? The Rambam stresses chazra malchut liYisrael, sovereignty returned to the Jewish people. In other words, if the Rambam were alive today, he would probably call Hanukah Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, because Hanukah is the war for Jewish independence, for Jewish sovereignty. Now this is very clearly an important source for religious Zionist support of the State of Israel. On the other hand, we're not naive, and we know that within the Haredi community, there are those ultra-Orthodox who oppose the State of Israel, mainly for two reasons. Firstly, the Agudat Yisrael, which is the vast majority, they oppose the State of Israel because it's secular. It's not as religious as we would like it to be. Religious Zionists also would like the state to be more religious, but the Agudat Yisrael, they prefer participating in a very limited way. The second point of opposition, that of the Neturei Karta and the Satmar Rebbe, who write that they don't care that the State of Israel is secular. Of course, they would like to be religious, but they said even if all of the leaders and the prime ministers and the government were totally religious, they would still oppose the State of Israel for a second reason, because they are waiting for Mashiach ben David. They believe that we are not supposed to have a Jewish king, a Jewish leadership, until the Messiah from the house of David comes. And these are the 2 points of opposition. On the other hand, if we look back in the Rambam that we started off with, we notice 2 very interesting things. You may have noticed it as I read it. The Rambam goes out of his way to point out twice that the Maccabees were Kohanim, and they set up a king from their family, the Kohanim. Why is it so important to the Rambam that the Maccabees were Kohanim? Well, if you know the Rambam in other places, is very clear. The Rambam himself, in his Book of the Mitzvot, in Negative Commandment 362, he writes that you're not allowed to have a king who is not from the tribe of Judah. And the Maccabees, who were Kohanim, were transgressing that prohibition. He even gives an example. The Rambam says, just like a Kohen, just like the king cannot give a sacrifice because he's not a Kohen, so too the Kohen cannot be king because he's a priest. They're 2 different jobs. So what is the Rambam saying? When he stresses twice, the Maccabees were Kohanim, and they set up a king from the Kohanim, the Rambam is clearly saying, I'm not naive. I know very well that the Maccabees were Kohanim, and that's a problem, halachically. But even so, it's so important to have an independent Jewish state. Even though it's not the ideal Jewish state, we still celebrate Hanukah. We still celebrate Israeli independence. But there's another point. The Rambam goes out of his way to stress that we celebrate more than 200 years of Maccabean sovereignty. Why is that important? The Rambam is not a history book. Why does he go out of his way to stress the 200 plus years? Well, if you know something about these 200 years, you know that most of the time the Maccabean dynasty was not religious. Just look at their names. Aristobulus, Hyrcanus, Alexander Yanai, Horus, you only get to 200 if you include even the years of Herod and Antipater and that whole family who might not even really been Jewish. Nevertheless, the Rambam says, we don't just celebrate the 40 years when there was a religious state. He says we celebrate all 200 years of the Maccabean dynasty. And the Rambam himself, in his commentary on the Mishnah, in the first chapter, Masechet Yoma, points out, he knows very well, the Maccabean dynasty, the kings, as is common knowledge, he writes, they were not religious. In other words, the Rambam is saying that even though for most of the 200 years the Maccabean dynasty was not religious, they were Hellenists, we still celebrate Israeli independence. We still celebrate Hanukah. And the modern ramifications are very clear because the exact 2 points of opposition that the Haredim have against the state of Israel are the same 2 points that you would oppose, that you might have thought of opposing against celebrating Hanukkah. The Rambam says, you know what, the Haredim say, we oppose the state of Israel because it's secular. Well, the Rambam already pointed out that the Maccabean dynasty also was not religious. And those who oppose it because they say we can only have a king from Mashiach ben David, from the lineage of David, well, the Rambam already pointed out that also the Maccabees were Kohanim. They were not from the right family. And even though the state of Israel at that time and today is not exactly as we would like it, the Rambam is giving us an interesting precedent of how religious Jews should still celebrate the state of Israel and Israeli independence. To summarize, if you don't celebrate the Israeli independence, Yom Ha'atzmaut, you should not be celebrating Hanukkah either. But if you do celebrate Hanukkah, you should also be celebrating the state of Israel's independence, even though it's not the ideal state of Israel. Hanukkah Sameach.